2017's Ghost in the Shell live-action film has had so many videos made on it, but everyone that has talked about it as a case of whitewashing or betraying the source material or complaining that people talk about it from the perspective of the source material. But the one key place that no one looks at it from is from the perspective of a Cyberpunk fan. Because the identity of Gits as Cyberpunk is crucial to how it fits into the cultural identity that was tied with Western anime viewership of the era. The Cyberpunk aesthetic and narrative movement is one that is so in line with nerd culture that I think we need to dissect the ways in which Gits 2017 fails to be Cyberpunk. Cyberpunk is a mixture of two key elements, and neither of them are that cyber at the beginning. While aesthetically it may utilize cybernetic reality, it can just be occurring in a modern world, which can be seen through the lens of a game like Shin Megami Tensei Devil Survivor, where the technology that is present is no different from the time of the release of the game, other than there is an obvious abstraction, as to not be uncanny. So defining cyberpunk must be outside of the core of the aesthetic principles, therefore delimiting between the aesthetically cyberpunk and the narratively so. So what are these two core elements and how do they relate? And more so, what makes the combinations of these two elements so special? Cyberpunk is about the philosophy of humanity, and the specific philosopher that we will be looking at is Friedrich Nietzsche, who said a lot of important things, but we specifically will be looking at the role of society in his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Zarathustra had proclaimed that society had to set a goal in a post-God existence, and this goal was to create the Übermensch, who would go on, in essence, to fill the role of God in society, whilst not being idolized in the same way. And this philosophy is what Noir was rooted in, whether or not it was intentional. So we have the Übermensch and society's roles filled out in how cyberpunk has to be on a philosophical level. So let's look at how this fits into the original Ghost in the Shell. To quote the book Reload, Rethinking Women Plus Cyberculture by Mary Flanagan and Austin Booth. The first model is apparently a new one, in which the heroine is the real hero in cyberspace over her male counterpart, an intelligent computer genius, physically well-trained and audacious, simultaneously sexually appealing and martially adept, or an indestructible female cyber-protagonist of synthetic flesh, e.g. Motoko Kusanagi in Mamoru animated science fiction thriller Ghost in the Shell, in other words, a female version of the Übermensch. So, our Übermensch is the Major, as she was constructed as the ideal being in a world, and so the interactions with the world are primarily built around this relationship, which can also be seen in the standalone complex when we see her room. The sparse nature of this room is a clear division between her and the standard humans who walk the streets she looks over. So, you say, we have our very basic simplification of the philosophical principle which you, a random blogger who I happen to stumble upon whilst browsing through the endless stream of content that is constantly updating in the post-television world, has said this extremely poorly defined genre is based upon. What is the other element? And to that, I would say, well, I lied earlier. In fact, there are two elements, but one of them is a kind of derivative of the other. In a way, but also completely unrelated. Let's take a look at Tokyo Cyberpunk, Posthumanism in Japanese Visual Culture by Stephen T. Brown. Note that the following passage directly refers to Ghost in the Shell 2.0, Innocence, as opposed to the original film, and that I am skipping over his writings on Akira. I do recommend reading this book for yourself. Brown states, Oshii has stated in interviews that an understanding of the uncanny is important to understanding the ningyo. And this understanding of the uncanny is not only present, but a core theme to many of the great cyberpunk works, from the replicants of Blade Runner to the entire game of the Talos Principle. And with this core understanding of the uncanny, we can then look at something related to, but also completely separate, the idea of punk. Conceptually, the linkage of punk to uncanny is really interesting. Uncanny is always going to be making you question yourself about what you believe is real and what is fake. And there have been points where elements of fiction have been able to break that border into looking real, yet there is always that something missing, some degree of soul. So when you link that missing humanity to the uncanny sense of aesthetics, you get something that is nearly impossible, that is hard to pass. We have a clear loop in understanding what defines punk. Punk is closely tied to the uncanny, but is not the same thing. Uncanny comes from things that are inhuman, which attempt to appear as such. Often this causes a break in immersion. This effect is obviously referred to as the uncanny valley. But this isn't the premise that we are working with. Rather, we're dealing with the overall concept of uncanny, which is best exemplified in the replicants from Blade Runner. And that is where the most interesting case of the cyberpunk identity lies. In Deckard, we see so many of the fundamental elements in crafting that identity, and even more so in the world he inhabits. Deckard, in my case, for the cyberpunk definition, is a paradox, an impossible being if the author is not dead. This being that, as an element of synthetic life, he should not be able to inhabit space which he assisted in forming. That of the neo-punk ideology. Punk requires life in its subject, and it requires those subjects to attempt to come off as uncanny as humanly possible. This division between the clearly defined humanity of a character and their attempts to become synthetic is exactly where the meaning of punk lies. Not embracing what makes a human, but rather the fusion of humanity with technology, at least in cybercentric fiction. So how does Ghost of the Shell fail at this understanding of the cyberpunk genre, and what can we do to make sure that cyberpunk is going to live on in more places than just the hallowed halls of CD Projekt Red? Ghost in the Shell 2017 is about a weak person. Ghost in the Shell in 2017 is not about the interactions that the Ubermensch has with society at large. Ghost in the Shell 2017 is embracing a false understanding of the world that it has to inhabit. Whether or not the director had good intentions is irrelevant to me. The writers and producers of the mass market of the Western cinema have failed once more to make a science fiction narrative well, and here's why. 1987 was a very special year in media for a lot of reasons. With the release of Digital Devil Story, Megami Tensei, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and Blade Runner all coming out, in the most important development of 1987 was an aesthetic sensibility which was pioneered by one man, and lived and died by his hands. Quite literally, this man is dead, and there is no sense of his aesthetic ideals anywhere. Jordan Cronweth was a visual pioneer, and though his filmography is relatively small, he had handcrafted the visual identity that would end all visual identities. If I put the entire film of Blade Runner here, it still wouldn't be enough for people to get exactly what it was he was doing, but his exploitation of light as an art is what made cyberpunk an aesthetic movement. Being seen literally everywhere, searchlights and streetlights, look at Deckard Sleep Tight, even in the best might modern artists can't fight. Modern film has become visually homogeneous, and that's why cyberpunk isn't able to thrive. While we have the technology of the distant future today, we lack the requisite visionaries to actually make that setting interesting. And it's this lack of utilization of the future that we currently inhabit that causes this lacking of this identity of the future. If you want to look at a really good example of how the future can be used well, look no further than Blade Runner. Set in the distant future of 2019, neon lights inhabit everything, and we see this world. We see this aesthetically built world. And that's realistically what cyberpunk is. Though it is, on one hand, a philosophical movement, on the other, it is just that of aesthetics. Cyberpunk is about creating how you feel, and similar to Vaporwave and to all of these other genres that have derived from that same utilization of the past's vision of tomorrow, we are able to see what the world can realistically be. If science fiction is the chance to build the pioneers of tomorrow today, then what cyberpunk is to build the world that tomorrow would actually create. We don't have an ideologically centered world, rather we have an aesthetically centered one. Blade Runner is the world in which Blade Runner inhabits is all about how characters feel within it. And that's what makes it so special. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, leave a like, comment, and subscribe. Consider supporting me on Patreon. And if you like me, and don't know that I run a podcast with Lachlan Still, the Pedantic Romantic, you can go and check that out over on this channel. Thanks for watching.